why did Darwin become popular? Evolution was not a new idea. It had been around for thousands of years. Darwin's father was big into evolutionary ideas. So, but evolution really didn't catch on until Darwin came along, as far as science is concerned. Before Darwin, most scientists believed in the Bible in America. And then after Darwin, there was a secular shift. So what did Darwin come up with that made it possible? Well, Darwin, he took a trip to the Galapagos Islands and he started noticing that things changed. Before Darwin, it was thought by most people, even scientists, that everything is static, nothing changes, all species are fixed. And Darwin started noticing these finches on the Galapagos Islands, and he noted all kinds of different types of finches, and some that could do special things, use tools, and other ones that had big beaks that could crack nuts. And as the weather changed over time, then these birds changed, how they appeared. And he's like, these birds are changing. And it's the same thing happens with all kinds of other animals, dogs and cats and cows, and everything changes over time. And so there wasn't this fixity of species, and that kind of got him thinking, well, maybe things change over vast periods of time a lot. And so he got to be thinking about this, and it kind of worried him because he was a Christian. He went to theology school, trained to be a pastor. And but before he became interested in evolution and science, and his wife was a very conservative Christian lady, and she did not like where he was going. But other things happened to him that affected him on a deep personal level, and I'd like to talk to you about that first before we got onto into his theory. He said interesting things. I cannot persuade myself that a beneficent and omnipotent God would have designedly created parasitic wasps with the express intention of their feeding within the living bodies of caterpillars. So how can a good God make things that eat other things from the inside out? And the other thing is the mystery of the beginning of all things is insoluble by us, and I, for one, must be content to remain an agnostic. People say that Darwin was an atheist and then he became converted on his deathbed. As far as I know, he was not. He remained an agnostic his whole life. He just didn't know. He couldn't put two and two together. How could a good God make things that are obviously evil? And what really the final nail in the coffin, I hate to say nail in the coffin, when I show this slide, is that Darwin had 10 children, and 3 of them died. 2 of them died. One died in infancy, another one died when he was a toddler at 18 months old with Down syndrome. And what really did it for him is his oldest daughter, Annie. She died at 10 years of age of scarlet fever. And that just ruined him. I mean, he was devastated by this. He was really close to his daughter. And at this point, before Annie died, he didn't want to really publish his ideas because his wife, he was more interested in his family's well-being. But after Annie died, he kind of lost it, and he decided he was going to publish. He was going to publish his ideas. So this really shook him. Also, Darwin's ideas led him, not only just his culture, but his ideas as well, led him to kind of be racist and sexist. Even though he grew up in a racist and sexist environment anyway, and even Christians in England at that time were racist and sexist. But Darwin's ideas kind of gave a more scientific argument, or it sounded more scientific anyway. For example, in his book, The Descent of Man, published in 1871, he said, "It is an interesting fact that the ancient races," he's talking about Negroes and Aborigines in particular in this book, in this and several other cases, more frequently present structures which resemble those of lower animals than do the modern races. One chief cause seems to be that ancient races stand somewhat nearer to a long line of descent to their remote animal-like progenitors." And Darwinism did not lay the groundwork for racism. Again, all by itself, racism and sexism have been around for a very long time, even within Christian cultures and societies. But Darwinism made it seem plausibly scientific, these concepts. Again, in Descent of Man, the aid which we feel impelled to give the helpless is mainly an incidental result of an instinct of sympathy. In other words, we help people that are sick and diseased because we have an instinct of sympathy, which we evolved. But if we were to intentionally neglect the weak and the helpless, it could only be for a contingent benefit with a certain and great present evil. Hence, we must bear without complaining the undoubtedly bad effects of weak surviving and propagating their kind. But there appears to be at least one check in steady action. Namely, the weaker and inferior members of society should not marry so freely as the sound. And this check might be indefinitely increased, though this is more to be hoped for than expected. In other words, don't let them pass on their genes, right? If they're weak in society. And was there any culture who implemented that shortly after Darwin? The Nazis, right? And they did this because it was scientific. Darwinism and the future of Negroes and Australian Aborigines. At some future period, not very distant by measure of centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. And at the same time, the anthropomorphous apes, as Professor Schaffhausen has remarked, will no doubt be exterminated. The break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between man and in a more civilized state, as we may hope, even than the Caucasian and some ape as low as the baboon, instead of, as now, between the Negro or Australian and the gorilla. So again, remember, he's a product of his time. Everybody thought like this. And remember also that Darwin was opposed to slavery. He was adamantly opposed to slavery. He considered it an evil of the day. And so he was actually quite advanced for his time as far as slavery is concerned and as far as civil rights. But he still considered Caucasians more evolved than any other race on the planet. And the chief distinction in intellectual powers of the two sexes, just so you women are included, is shown by man's attaining to a higher eminence in whatever he takes up than can woman, whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of the sense of the hands. So he would have a pretty good opinion of himself. If I said that to Sigrid, I'd be at the doghouse tonight. I just might as well not go home. So anyway, he considered men more evolutionarily advanced than women as well. And so what do you women think about the science of that? I can close right now when you guys have all cheered. Anyway. So how does the Darwinian view of origins and its complications, or its implications, compare with the Bible's claim and its implications? For example, in Acts 17:26 it says, "From one man he has made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth." What does that imply? It implies we're all equal, right? There is no superior race that's more evolved than any other. And in fact, modern science has kind of demonstrated this. We're all DNA-wise extremely closely related. And so Darwin was wrong already, and he didn't know. He just assumed things that just aren't true. However, if he had read the Bible literally, he should have known, because God told him right there, that all man is equal. All are of one blood. So the races emerged from an original man and evolution from some original sludge in some ancient pond, or more recently from some ape-like ancestor. It's very different ethical implication as far as how we should treat our fellow man. Other implications of Darwinism. Richard Dawkins, in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, he says, although atheism might have been logically tenable before Darwin, there was a lot of atheists before Darwin came along, Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Now, how did he do that? It's because Darwin provided a natural explanation, mindless mechanism, to explain all of life. And before that, there was no rational explanation for life. And so Darwin comes along and says, I can explain everything with a mindless mechanism. There's no need to invoke God or even any intelligence at all. And so this is why Richard Dawkins says, now I can be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. So Darwinism, again, made atheism seem more scientific and therefore more rational. And also other implications. William Praveen, late professor at Cornell, he said, naturalistic evolution has clear consequences that Charles Darwin understood perfectly. Number one, no gods worth having exist. No life after death exists. No ultimate foundation for ethics exists. In other words, you can do whatever you want. It doesn't matter because there's no really logical foundation for ethics. No ultimate meaning in life exists. We're here, we die, that's it. Right? And human free will is non-existent. You're a product of your genes, and you can't do anything other than how you've been coded to act. You're not responsible, therefore, ultimately for your actions. So don't feel bad, right? About anything that you do. And if Darwin was correct, if really evolution is all there is, and you live and you die, and that's it, and we came from pond sludge, I think William Praveen is right. Right? But if we didn't come from pond sludge, it implies that maybe we have a little bit of God in us, that God has put some sort of moral compass inside each one of us, and that's why we feel bad when we do bad things. So then Praveen went on, he said, in other words, religion is compatible with modern evolutionary biology, and indeed all of modern science, if religion is effectively indistinguishable from atheism. And I think that's right. If Darwin is right, the Bible is wrong. There's just no compatibility. You can't harmonize the two. And I'm more impressed with evolutionists like Richard Dawkins and William Praveen because they take it to its rational, logical conclusion. They're all or nothing, right? Whereas I'm much less impressed with Christian evolutionists because I think you're completely irrational to be a Christian evolutionist. They just don't combine. Christianity makes fundamental claims that are diametrically opposed to evolutionary thinking. Darwin's theory. So what did he say that changed the world? He said, I have called this principle by which slight variations, if useful, are preserved by the term natural selection. In his book, Origin of the Species in 1859. So what is natural selection? Natural selection is where nature selects in offspring, the offspring that have mutations that give them a survival or a reproductive advantage over their peers, over their siblings. And so as you keep selecting out these advantageous peers, and then they reproduce their offspring, and then they get different advantages in different groups, then you build this little tree. And different groups go on and make different species, and then they go on from there. And this is Darwin's own drawing in the margin of his book. And then this is kind of fleshed out, and pretty soon, we're at the tippy branch of one of these branches here on this tree, and we all ultimately came from some single-celled organism in a warm pond somewhere, according to Darwinian thinking. So did Darwin think there might be any potential limitations to his mechanism of natural selection? He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down, but I could find no such case. So that's the whole goal. If you can find anything that cannot be explained by slight successive modifications of something that came before, you have evidence of design, according to Charles Darwin. So let me give you some examples of this. These are the things that Darwin observed. He observes changes in finch beaks, changes in roses, changes in dogs, changes in moths, different colored moths, like peppered moths, the famous peppered moth. But what is ironic about all these changes is that they're not Darwinian. They're not really evolution at all. There's something else called Mendelian variation, or based on Mendelian genetics. And what's interesting is that Gregor Mendel, he knew about Darwin, but Darwin did not know about Mendel's work. Mendel's work was discovered later. And I have a suspicion that if Mendel had become famous before Darwin, it would have been a whole lot harder for Darwinism to catch on. Because what Mendel discovered is that there is pre-programmed potential for variation in every sexually reproducing living thing. And so that's why, I am fairly light-skinned, my hair is lighter colored, and I'm not very hairy. But my brother is a furball. He has dark hair and dark skin. And we came from the same parents, at least my parents tell me that. Right? So how did that happen? It happened because of Mendelian variation. The very same gene pool can produce very different offspring without any need of mutation whatsoever. And though I used to tell my brother he must be a mutant, but evidently he's not. So it's based on genetic recombination where gene variations are already pre-programmed right there sitting there, and they swap places, back and forth, they swap places, and depending on what swaps in or out, you can produce all kinds of different expressions of different types of things, depending on what's pre-programmed there. For example, let's say you have a bike shop, you have options for different type of tires. You have a knobby tire, and you have a smooth tire, and you have a slick tire. And so they're all hanging on the wall, and you can go in the bike shop, I would like that tire and that pair of handlebars and those pedals, blah, 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 and then put them all together and make your bike. Or I would like a knobby tire and the other set of handlebars, and I would like this type of pedal and put them together. But can you pick anything that's not hanging on the wall already? No. And so Mendelian variation is extensive. You can do a lot of variation with it, but it's also finite. It's limited. It's not unlimited like Darwinian evolution. So what can you do with Mendelian variation? Well, take dogs, for example. Pretty much every modern breed of dog in existence today has been produced over the last 300 years using Mendelian variation. It's every breed of dog that we have is just a different reflection of a different part of the doggy gene pool. And it can happen very quickly because of that. Because all your different options are all there sitting on the wall, and you just have to pull them down, whichever ones you want. And you can do that by artificial breeding. This is what breeders do. Well, I want a dog with a long nose and a short tail and a fuzzy coat. Right? Well, you just take your little puppies and you take one that's more and more close to that, and you breed that one, and then you finally get to that point. And you do that because it's all there pre-programmed. But can you make a purple dog? Can you make a dog as small as a thimble? No. There's these limitations to doggy variation within Mendelian genetics because there's pre-programmed limitations. Not so in Darwinian evolution. Also, there's this difference in species versus kind. You know, the Bible talks about they produce after their kind, right? Is that the same thing as species? A lot of people think it's the same thing, but it's not. For example, a horse and a donkey can breed together and then produce a mule. Of course, a mule is sterile, and a mule can't reproduce. However, it's still part of the same gene pool. All the information is identical between them. You know why the mule is sterile? Why it can't reproduce? Because even though the information is all there exactly the same, there's a little chromosome between the donkey and the horse that's revert flipped. It's the same information, but it's just that piece of the chromosome will be chopped out and flipped over, upside down. That's it. That's the only difference. There's no difference in information. It's just the order of the information within the chromosome. And because of that little flip thing, when the mule goes to make gametes, they have to line up next to each other, and they can't line up next to each other properly because one of them is flipped upside down. And so in order to line up, the other one has to make a little loop in itself in order to try to match the other one. And when it loops, then when it tries to pull it apart to make the separate gametes, it fractures, it fragments. And so the gametes are not viable anymore, after genetically viable, and so that's what makes the mule sterile. It has nothing to do with different information as far as genetics is concerned, which I think is very interesting. But they're given different species names. Donkeys and horses, they're given different species names. And the same thing happens with other species. Lions and tigers are different species, according to how they're defined by biology. But you can produce ligers. Lions and tigers can make ligers. And ligers are interesting because they're bigger, stronger, and live longer than either lions or tigers. It's called hybrid vitality. And grizzly bears and polar bears can make grizzly bears. And horses and zebras can make zorses. And they're all part of the same gene pool, but they're given different species names. Also, Lisa here is a sheep and a goat. Lisa is a geek. And what's interesting is that sheep have 54 chromosomes and goats have 60 chromosomes, and geek have 57 chromosomes. They're in between. So it's even different numbers of chromosomes, but it's the same information but more chromosomes, or less chromosomes. But the same information, what happened is they just take a chromosome here and they stuck it onto another chromosome over here. So now, instead of being 2 chromosomes, there's 1. But it's still the same information. Same thing happened with humans, evidently. Humans have one of our chromosomes fused with another chromosome, and so we have less than we used to have. There was a small population a while back, which is consistent with a worldwide flood, by the way, because the whole human population got reduced to 8 people. And with such a small population, if you get any genetic defect, it's going to be passed on to pretty much everybody, right? So I think that's what happened with the human population. We suffered a chromosome fusion, which is not unheard of. It actually happens every now and then. And the same thing happens with other types of creatures as well. A pumapar, panther and a puma, they're different genuses, not just different species. And so where's the limit? Well, the limit is we can get different species intermixing, we can get different genuses intermixing. Rarely there are different interfamilies that can breed, like between guinea fowl hybrids can be produced. But there are no interordinal hybrids. So the limit seems to be at the family, and that only rarely happens. And so the real limiting factor is the difference in the type of information between one gene pool and another. Gene pools are isolated, I think, originally by the level of complexity within the type, unique qualitative type of information that the gene pool codes for. Mendelian genetics can produce new information. However, there are certain clear limits. Anybody believe this? If you grew up in Wyoming, this is a fact of life, right? No, there's limitations. So are there any examples of real evolution that go beyond Mendelian genetics? And a lot of Christians would say no, but this is not true. There are real examples of evolution. Natural selection is a real force of nature, which makes it a little complicated to figure out why Darwinism is wrong, because Darwinism is actually right, at least on a certain level. Natural selection is a real force of nature. There is survival of the fittest. There are genetic mutations, and some of them are beneficial. So you're like, how are you still a creationist, right? Well, there's limits. So let me explain. There's different types of evolution that are based on random mutations and natural selection. I call them type 1 and type 2 because in medical school, if someone asks you a question that you don't know on rounds, medical rounds, like an attending, okay, Dr. Pitman, what's the, some medical difficult question, and you don't have any clue, you're just like, well, is that type 1 or type 2? so you can get out of that, because usually the attending won't know. And you look like, oh, wow, you know even more than the attending. So, it's type 1 and type 2 evolution. So this is an example of type 1 evolution, or what I call devolution, the loss of something that was already there. Which of these fish do you think came first? The one with an eye or the one without an eye?
No.
The one without came first? Anybody? Raise your hand if you think the one without came first. Now raise your hand if you think the one with the eye came first. The ones with the eyes have it. The fish without the eye came from evolved or devolved from the fish with the eye. The reason why the fish lost his eyes is because he became a cave fish, and there's no light in the cave, and there's no need. So any mutation that happens by random chance to destroy eyes, destroy the genes for eyes, mess it up by mutation, makes the fish not grow an eye. But who cares? You're in a cave, you can compete just fine with all the other fish that have eyes. And so pretty soon all the fish lose their eyes. Because if you don't use it, you lose it, right? So this is what happens. They lose it when they're in the cave. Now what happens if you take this cave fish without eyes and you put it back in a pond outside with light? What happens to his offspring? Can he get the eye back? Yes, he can. What's really interesting is they can, because what happens, how do these fish lose their eyes? Only 1 or 2 or 3 small mutations completely disrupt the eye gene, mess it all up. So it can't make eyes. But if you just suffer one reversion mutation, like you turn the switch off, now you turn it back on. Just one mutation makes it so it grows eyes again. Why? Because the whole rest of the gene is not deleted. It's still there. It's just got one little switch turned off so it can't grow. Right? So you turn the switch back on, the rest of the gene is there and it works fine and the eyes come back. Now what happens if you never had eyes to begin with? Can you turn the eye switch on just like that? No. You have to have eyes in your ancestry in order to do that. So it's downhill evolution, devolution. Same thing with malaria, sickle cell anemia. The way that, there's people who can survive fine in Africa where malaria is endemic because they have a mutation in a gene that codes for hemoglobin in their blood. And the reason why the malaria doesn't infect them very well is because the gene that makes the hemoglobin doesn't work very well anymore. All you do is change one letter in the hemoglobin protein, just one amino acid, click, and now the hemoglobin molecule cannot carry oxygen as well anymore. So the oxygen tension drops for these people, but the malaria doesn't like that, right? The malaria organism needs a certain level of oxygen to do well, and so when it tries to infect people who don't have that oxygen tension, it dies, right? So survival of the fittest, but they're not fittest, right? They're less fit, but they survive better, right? So it's a loss of function to increase their survival. Flightless cormorants on the Galapagos Islands. Darwin saw these birds and said, aha, evolution, because they got these little stubby wings and they can't fly anymore. And so how did this happen? Because here's a cormorant that can fly, that doesn't live on the Galapagos. It's because when the birds went to the Galapagos, they drifted off course and landed there. It's a windy island. And in order to survive there, you keep getting blown out to sea. Well, you don't want to get blown out to sea. You want to stay around and fish, right? So the birds that couldn't fly very well, that didn't get blown out to sea and stranded somewhere else in the middle of the ocean and died, well, those birds, they had mutations that make their wings stubby and they couldn't grow feathers very well, and now they can't fly at all. And is that a gain in function or a loss of function? It's a loss of function, right? So it's a survival advantage that's due to a loss of function or devolution. Here's a toxin injector on your guys' left. It's called a type 3 secretory system, and here's a flagellum on your right. It's a bacterial motility motor. It's a rotary motor that spins around and around and makes bacteria swim through water or solution. The type 3 secretory system looks exactly like a part of the flagellum. It has 10 proteins that match 10 proteins of the 50 proteins that make up the flagellum. Which of these do you think came first? The smaller one or the bigger one? The bigger one? Yes. Well, I don't know. Here's a little video clip, and we'll see somebody else's opinion on this before we talk about it.
Third thing that was abundantly clear at the trial, these great icons of intelligent design, the things that are supposedly unevolvable, they've fallen apart. Example, specifically taken apart at the trial, the notion that the bacterial flagellum couldn't have been produced by evolution, or the blood clotting cascade, or the generation of biological information. I don't have time to talk about all three, but I'm going to show you two of them. The notion that these complicated biochemical structures couldn't have been produced by evolution has been championed by Michael Behe. And Behe has an idea that he calls irreducible complexity. And he says, you can't evolve these things because they're irreducibly complex. Notice what he says. An irreducibly complex system can't be produced the way that evolution works, by numerous successive slight modifications of a precursor system, because any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. These are multi-part systems. And he's basically telling you that the 30 or 40 proteins that are in here, they all have to be together or there's no function. And since natural selection does have to work gradually, I agree on that point, it can't produce 20, 25, 26 proteins knowing what will eventually happen because natural selection is blind, which is indeed absolutely true. So the poster child for intelligent design by any standard, it shows up so often, it really could be called the poster child, is in fact the bacterial flagellum. This was mentioned so often in the trial that the judge, probably from fatigue, got a little sarcastic about it. One of the attorneys said, Your Honor, when we reconvene, we're going to talk again about the bacterial flagellum. And the judge at one point said, oh, goody. The last expert witness for the Board of Education, a biochemist named Scott Minnick from the University of Idaho, was called up to the stands to talk about this. And since Behe had talked about it, and the lawyers had talked about it, and they had argued about it, and I had talked about it, as I'm going to show you here for a second, Minnick got up there And he said he was going to talk about the bacterial flagellum. And the judge deadpanned, well, we've heard that before. And Minnick turned to him, this is the best line of the trial, Minnick turned to him and said, you know, Your Honor, I sort of feel like Zsa Zsa Gabor's fifth husband. I know what to do, I just don't know how to make it exciting. So I take my hat off to Scott. That was good. I like that. So what is this argument about? Here's the argument in very simplified form. If you have a complex, multi-part biochemical machine composed of many parts, its function, everyone agrees, can be favored by natural selection. But the argument is that evolution can't produce them because the individual parts have no function of their own. That's what irreducible complexity means. So natural selection can't make this, doesn't have any function. Can't make that, can't make that. Therefore, you can't evolve a structure like this. Now, how does evolution explain something like that? Well, ever since Darwin, we've had a very good explanation. And that is these complicated machines, they don't arise from scratch. They arise from combinations of components that have different functions, functions of their own. And the components originate with functions of their own as well. Therefore, natural selection will work every step of the way. Now, that's not evidence, that's just an argument. But the beauty of this is we can now hold these two ideas up against each other. And we can say, who's right? If irreducible complexity is right, then the parts of these machines should be absolutely useless. But if evolution is right, we should be able to take these machines, look at their parts, and discover, wow, they do other jobs. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's take the bacterial flagellum. So if we start with the flagellum, here it is, and these drawings name the genes and the proteins in the flagellum, and we say, let's take away a whole bunch of the parts. How many? Not 1, not 5, not 10. Let's take 40 of its 50 parts away. Now watch very carefully, because I'm going to do that experiment right there. There it goes. The parts are all gone, and I have left 10 parts that span the membrane. What are left behind are 10 proteins in the base of the flagellum. Now, if irreducible complexity is right, this should be absolutely functionless. It should have no function. But if you'll pardon the double negative, what is left behind is not non-functional. What is left behind is the type 3 secretory system, and it is fully functional. I know most of you in the room are going, of course, the type 3 secretory system. The type 3 secretory system is a molecular syringe in which some of the nastiest bacteria on this planet produce toxic proteins, grab onto one of our cells, and inject those proteins into our cells. The bacterium that causes bubonic plague works this way. It's really nasty stuff. Well, guess what? The 10 proteins that make up the type 3 secretory system are directly homologous to the 10 proteins in the base of the bacterial flagellum. They don't produce movement. They're not a flagellum. But are they functional? They are fully functional. So remember that claim. Any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that is missing a part is by definition non-functional. This guy is missing 40 parts, and it is perfectly functional. What that means, there's no other word for it, is that that statement is wrong. Now, that's not an incidental statement. That is the heart and soul of the intelligent design argument. And in this case, it turns out to be wrong. Now, it's even wronger than that, because it turns out that not only do these proteins make up the type 3 secretory apparatus, but almost every protein in the bacterial flagellum is strongly homologous to proteins that have other functions elsewhere in the cell. And what that means is when we look at this wonderful icon of intelligent design, a careful analysis of the flagellum actually matches evolutionary theory, namely the parts should have functions of their own and not the intelligent design prediction. And that's simply a fact.
All right. If you could ask Kenneth Miller, he's a biologist, a famous biologist, written a lot of textbooks on evolution for all our students in America. If you could ask him which came first, the type 3 secretory system or the flagellum, what do you think he would say? You think he would say the type 3 secretory system came first since it's smaller? He would definitely say that. At least during this lecture he would have said that. In reality, several years later, what do you think was discovered? It turns out that in real life, real-time experiments directly observed in action, it was observed that the type 3 secretory system came from the flagellum. It's a degenerative change because which is easier, to delete something or to create it? To delete it, right? And if you delete something and something else smaller still functions, it's like parasites. Are parasites more or less complex than stuff that goes out and has to search for its own food? They're less complex. The type 3 secretory system is part of parasitic bacteria, bubonic plague, things that attack other living tissues in a parasitic manner and leach off of other things. These are parasitic organisms that do this. And they're less complex. They're not more complex. They've evolved. Kind of like this car. This is not really a car. This is just a giant flashlight. So you take the tires off, and of course the car can't work as a motility system anymore, but it can still work as a giant flashlight. Does that mean that the car evolved? Because subsystems can still work. The radio still works for a while, and you can use a light switch still for a while. Doesn't mean anything that the subsystem is functional as far as explaining the complexity of the motility function of the car. The motility function still requires a sizable minimum level of complexity. The same thing as the motility function for the bacterial flagellum. It's interesting that Kenneth Miller, he says, like it was something special. We took away 40 of the proteins. Well, why didn't you just take away one? Right? Then what would have happened? It's a much smaller gap. The fact that you have to go from 10 to 40 before you can get a flagellum motility system is a huge gap, statistically speaking. It's more complex than trying to evolve the entire universe as far as the special fundamental properties of the universe are concerned. So here's another example. The evolution of function of meaning by putting the same sequences in different contexts. You can get different meanings. For example, consider the word home. Does that evoke meaning for anybody here? Well, let's change the context a little bit. Follow the word home throughout this example and see what happens to the meaning of the word home. So you go home, changes things a little bit. Go home tomorrow, changes things a little bit, but not too much as far as the meaning of home is concerned. Go home tomorrow afternoon, okay. We're evolving along. You will go home tomorrow afternoon. When the hearse gets here, you will go home tomorrow afternoon. And when the hearse gets here, you will go home tomorrow afternoon to your final resting place. Does that change the meaning of home for you? So if I start deleting things, I can start with a complex sentence like this and start deleting things, and every sentence, smaller and smaller, still has meaning, right? Does that mean that you can easily evolve up and as easily as you can evolve down? No, it doesn't mean that at all. And so that's still devolution. Now, again, like the children's story, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall, right? All the king's horses, all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again, right? Why not? Why is it so easy to break Humpty Dumpty, but not so easy to put him back together? The reason why it's so easy to break him is because there's so many different ways he can break, right? Many different ways he can break. How many ways are there to put him back together again? One, right? Or a very small number of ways, relative to the number of ways you can break it, right? So that's the reason why, statistically speaking, you can't put Humpty Dumpty so easily back together again. What about type 2 evolution? Something entirely new that's not based on a loss of something else. Are there any examples of that? And actually there are examples of real evolution where something new, qualitatively new evolves. So here's some examples. One example is aerobic citrate usage in E. coli. Richard Dawkins quoted this in The God Delusion. And he quotes this all the time as an example of how something new evolves. What happened is that Richard Linsky, he grew E. coli bacteria for 33,000 generations, and nothing happened. And then after 33,127 generations, bam-o! All of a sudden they started eating the citrate in their solution and growing faster. They evolved this ability out of nowhere, it seemed like, to eat citrate for energy. How in the world did they do this? Well, E. coli can eat citrate just fine when there's no oxygen around. But they can't eat it when there is oxygen around. And so he's growing them under oxygenated conditions. And then all of a sudden they gain the ability to eat citrate under oxygenated conditions. So how did they do this? Well, they already had the gene for citrase. What they did is took that gene, randomly clipped it out, and they moved it next to a promoter that's active during oxygenated conditions. And so they just moved the location of the gene. And all of a sudden, since it was close to a promoter that was active in oxygenated conditions, all of a sudden it could turn on the gene when oxygen was around, where before it was turned off. So it's just a moving of the gene. How easy is that to do? Just move the gene somewhere else where it's more active and within a genome. Well, it's evidently fairly difficult. It took 33,000 generations. That's, if you consider human generations, that's 20 years times 33,000. It's a long time. You know, that's almost 1 million years if you're talking about humans is concerned. So it's fairly complex just to move a genetic sequence somewhere else where it's more active within the genome. So was there a new protein that was produced? No new protein at all. The same protein was produced before, that's it. So no new protein. Is this new evolution of some brand new function? It's kind of, but no new structural protein was produced. But a new function sort of just by changing location. So I wouldn't say this is very high level. And it's the same protein just turned on in a different time. However, there are lots of examples actually, of brand new proteins that were never there before. They were evolved by random mutation, natural selection. They can do new things. Barry Hall's experiment with E. coli, again, these E. coli evolved a gene that produced a novel protein, wasn't there before, that could convert lactose into glucose and galactose and then use that lactose for energy when they couldn't do it before. It's a lactase enzyme. The enzyme was never there before. It mutated a different protein and now all of a sudden gained the lactase function. Man, well that's a real interesting example of evolution in action. But it's interesting because all the examples I could find in literature of evolution in action like this that produce something brand new, structurally new, a new gene, a new protein, they're all less than several hundred amino acids. They're all less than 300 or 400 amino acids in size. There are no examples at all that go over 500. Certainly nothing even comes close to 1,000 amino acids in literature. There are no examples of evolution in action where the function in question requires at least 1,000. To put that in perspective, the flagellum motility system requires 5,000. Nothing like that has ever been shown to evolve, ever. And so when I go and debate people, I say, show me an example of evolution in action that requires at least 1,000 amino acids to work. And no one has ever been able to do that. I've been doing this about 20 years. I've talked to some famous people, debated them online, and no one has ever been able to come up with that example. So why does evolution work at the lower level but not at the higher level? It's a mathematical problem. And don't glaze over now, but I have to talk a little bit about math. So I'll try to give you a visual. Here's a Scrabble board, my own Scrabble board. I took these letters and tossed them out there, and they just landed like that. You believe me? Yeah, right. Okay, pretty good. You're good so far. How about now? I took the letters, threw them out there, and they just landed like that. What if I did it 1,000 times? You believe maybe that might happen every now and then? If I threw it out 1,000 times, maybe. It's not completely unreasonable. Even though you can see a few words there, cat, pig, fur, something like that, not completely unreasonable. How about now? Believe me, if I said I did this a million times, and one of those times I just landed like that. You don't believe? Why not? It's statistics. That's why not. You have an internal sense of the odds of things happening. Well, what's actual math? The actual math, if you sit down and you say, okay, what's the sequence space size of two-letter sequences? And when I say sequence space, I mean every possible combination of two letters. What is the size? So you take 26 letters in the alphabet, raise that to the power of 2, and that's your answers. There's 677 squares. And for three-letter sequences, there's 17,576 possible combinations of 3 letters. So the question is, what's the ratio of meaningful versus meaningless in sequence space? For 2 letters, the ratio is 1 in 17. If you look up the Scrabble dictionary, there's 96 defined 2-letter words. And for three-letter words, the ratio is 1 in 18, thereabouts. So if you look at a three-letter sequence, for example, it's pretty easy to evolve them and get from one to the next by changing one letter at a time. So I can evolve from cat to hat to bad to bid to dig to dog, right? No problem. It's just changing one letter at a time. The odds of doing that are 1 in 18. If you have a population size, let's say 1 million different words all mutated at the same time, how hard would it get to, how long would it take to get from one to the other? It's just snap, 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 quick, right? Easy. Evolution is easy at this level. How about 7-letter sequences? What's the ratio now? And we're talking not just 7-letter words, but combinations of smaller words that make 7 letters total. Now you have to add a space, too, so that's 27 characters instead of 26. But the odds are exponentially decreasing. The odds now are 1 in 250,000, right? Thereabouts. So, and it goes exponential from there on out. It gets exponentially harder and harder the longer your sequence gets. And so evolution slows down exponentially. With each linear increase in the size, the minimum size requirement, and the minimum specificity requirement, the random walk time, the random mutation time that it takes to get to another beneficial, we're just talking meaningful here. If you add beneficial on top of that, it gets even worse. Right? Does everything meaningful beneficial? No. So it gets even worse. I'm just talking meaningful at this point. And so the random walk time gets exponentially longer as the sequence size linearly increases linearly. It's like stepping stones. Close to the riverbank, there's lots of stones. You can hop from one to the other, no problem. Even if you're blindfolded, you're going to hit another stone more often than not if you're close to the riverbank. However, the farther you go out into the lake, blindfolded, what are the odds that you're going to land on another rock? Right? Pretty soon you're swimming for it, blindfolded. Swimming for how long is it going to take you to find another rock? Swimming blindfolded. Well, it's going to take you exponentially longer and longer amounts of time to swim for it. And so there's no clear cutoff where evolution is impossible. It just becomes statistically more and more and more unlikely until you're just amazingly don't luck. I have some swampland in Florida to sell. You know, sort of. So here's a little video to illustrate. What's wrong? You don't believe that's possible? What's wrong with you? What are the odds? Right? So again, it's a statistical problem. We're back to Kenneth Miller. Here's the standard evolutionary argument. This is how they think. This is how they picture in their minds evolution working. So the Darwinian model. You start with a bunch of systems, small little systems, and they start combining with each other. And they combine, and then they get bigger groups that combine, and then they just add on. And it's easy. They fit together just like hand in glove, and pretty soon, before you know it, you got this big system. No problem. Started with a bunch of little ones, and they just linked up right together. Presto. That's what he had. That's his illustration in his video clips, remember? Right? So, this is the real model, or at least it's an illustration that's more real than his. So, the real world model. So what you have is a bunch of little systems, but they're not the same shape. They're not the same sequence. They don't match up automatically. It takes some time to get them to fit together. And when you're talking small little systems, it takes them even a little bit of time to fit together. 33,000 generations, right, for that one. And for the Kenneth Miller one, it took several generations as well. I mean, for the Barry Hall one. So you got this little move. It has to change a little bit, and the thing has to move a little bit, and finally they fit together. Okay, oh, that's possible because there's like 3-letter words, right? Small little systems get fit together. Finally, they get together. And you guys can do the same thing with a few other ones. The star doesn't quite fit, so it's got to mutate to fit. This triangle doesn't quite fit with the other one, so the other one has to mutate a little bit, and then they can finally get together. And then they start getting a little bigger, a little harder, mutate a little more before they can match. These ones finally get together. And that one, it has to mutate to fit onto the top of that one, to fit. And then this one has to doesn't quite fit that one, so it has to reduce the size and mutate a little bit. And then it still doesn't quite fit, so this has to shift around. Since it's a little bigger, it takes a little bit more to do it. And then, how do you get this to connect with that one? Well, they're all too big. They don't quite fit, none of them, so they all have to shrink in size at the same time to fit. And so finally we get there. Well, what happens to the odds as you get bigger and bigger, with the bigger pieces of the puzzle have to fit together? Well, if you get something that's working working well in another system, and something over here working well in another system, and they're big chunks in both different systems, now you try to merge them together, what are the odds they're going to automatically fit together right up front? Not good at all. They're not going to fit together. They have to be modified. Well, how many modifications are required to get them to fit together? Well, the number of modifications required to get bigger systems to fit together increase linearly as the minimum size requirement of the final system increases linearly. So this big system and this big system, how many mutations have to be changed here, and how many mutations have to be changed here to get them to fit together? Well, the number increases linearly as the size increases linearly. And so within each increase in the linear number of mutations required to get systems to fit together, how much time is required? Each linear increase in the minimum number of mutations, the gap distance that you have to cross, if that increases linearly, the random walk time increases exponentially, right? And so pretty soon when you're at 1,000 amino acids, the random walk time is trillions and trillions and trillions of years, if you sit down and do the math. And the people say, well, you're just trying to get me to evolve something from scratch. Just poof something out of nothing that's 1,000 amino acids. No. Take anything that's already existing, something that's 900 amino acids there, already functioning, something that's 500 amino acids over there, already functioning, doing its thing, and use whatever you want that's already pre-existing. What are the odds of getting pre-existing systems to fit together and work? The odds are trillions and trillions of years. If you sit down and figure out the minimum likely gap distance that's required. And what I mean by gap distance is the number of mutations that are required to get things to fit together. It's trillions and trillions of years. I can't go into detail now, I don't have time, but I've worked out the math, I've done it in detail, and there's published statistics for this. And another big clue is there are no examples beyond a few hundred amino acids. There's none. Why not, if Darwinian evolution is so easy to explain? Why are there no examples? So, I'm not the only one either. He says, I now find myself driven to this position by logic. There's no other way in which we can understand the precise ordering of the chemicals of life except to invoke creations on a cosmic scale. We were hoping as scientists that there would be a way around our conclusion, but there isn't. And notice the title of their paper. He says, There Must Be a God, by Hoyle and Rick Ramsey, a mathematician. Frederick Hoyle is the one who came up with the phrase, the Big Bang Theory. Right? He finally concluded that there must be a God. All right. Here's John Sanford from Cornell University. And he wrote a book called Genetic Entropy. He started as an atheist, then he became interested in intelligent design and finally converted to Christianity because of his research into the science involved. And he said, late in my career I did something which for a Cornell professor would seem unthinkable. I began to question the primary axiom, random mutation, natural selection, as a creative force. I did this with great fear and trepidation. By doing this, I knew I would be at odds with the most sacred cow of modern academia. Among other things, it might even result in my expulsion from the academic world. He said, if the primary axiom is wrong, then there is a surprising and very practical consequence. When subjected only to natural forces, the human genome must irrevocably degenerate over time. Such a sober realization should have more than just intellectual or historical significance. It should rightfully cause us to personally reconsider where we should be rationally placing our hope for the future. In other words, we as a species, humans, are headed downhill, and we always have been. Because in each generation, each child has about 70 to 100 mutations that the parents didn't have. And of those 70 to 100 mutations, almost all of them are slightly detrimental to some degree or another. None of them are beneficial. And so to even get rid of 3 detrimental mutations, the average, and that's only 3 out of the 100, let's say only 3 of them are detrimental, the rest are neutral. The average woman would have to give birth to 20 children. And of the 20, 18 would have to die prematurely. How many women are doing your part? Right? And, well, just so you men don't laugh too hard, where do you think most of the mutations come from? Men. Us men are responsible for more of the mutations than the women are. Because the women's eggs get frozen in time. When a woman is a fetus, they get frozen in time and they don't change or anything. We men, we keep producing more and more soldiers all the time, right? And we keep mutating them, right? And so the older we get, the more mutations we have. By the time, do you know why we get old and die? By the time you're 60 years old, you have 60,000 mutations in every cell, right? 40 to 60,000 mutations in every cell. And pretty soon your cells just can't function anymore with all those mutations, changing all the letters on you all the time. You don't make your skin as well, you don't make your hair as well, you don't see as well, your heart doesn't function. Pretty soon you just fall apart, right? You get old. Same thing happens as a species, except the mutations don't come as fast, only 100 per generation instead of 60,000 by the time you're 60, right? But eventually they add up. They add up over time. My children, Wesley and Bradley, they each have 100 mutations that I don't have. And their children have another 100 mutations that I don't have. That's 200 mutations. So, since Adam and Eve, if you just consider the Bible and generation, we've only been around not very long, only a few hundred generations. Not even 1,000 generations since Adam and Eve, if you count a generation time as 20 years or so. So, we just haven't been here very long. And we couldn't have been here very long. Because once you start thinking, how long as a species can we survive? Can we survive 1 million years at mutation rate at this rate? No, not at all. We'd be gone. We'd be extinct. We'd be a genetic meltdown as a species. So there's no, and John Sanford says, so where should you be placing your hope in the future? In random mutation natural selection? No. The only one who can solve this is the Creator, the designer of life. So, I know we're a little bit late, but usually people look at creationists and they look and think of us like this guy says, I know what I believe and that's it. The Bible's right and you're wrong. La 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 la. I don't want to hear you anymore. Don't talk to me, right? So is that how we should be? No, it's like, fine, talk to me. Tell me what you have, right? Give me your best shot. One question now.
You can go first.
Go ahead.
Well, I was wondering what the evolutionary argument was for randomly generating information. Do they have any argument that information can randomly generate itself?
Yeah, I mean, that's what random mutations are supposed to do, randomly generate information. But it also depends on how you define information. A lot of people, like there's this definition in scientific literature called Shannon information, or Shannon entropy. But it unfortunately uses the term Shannon information. But Shannon information is really a description or a definition of randomness or chaos. Anybody hear of chaos theory? Chaos theory, there's even movies about it called Chaos Theory, the Butterfly Effect. Hear about that? That's all based on Shannon information or Kolmogorov-Chaitin complexity. But that's all a definition of randomness. And randomness is defined by something that's not predictable. That's why the butterfly effect and all that. Where a butterfly flaps its wings 3 years ago and a hurricane happens in Florida. Right? It's unpredictable. The same thing with weather patterns. But that's not really information in the meaningful sense of the term. That's just unpredictability. So meaningful information by random mutation, again, all examples, they'll tell you that random mutations and natural selection produced every living thing and every variation that we see. But it's like, okay, can you give me a real example, like something I can actually see happen in the laboratory? And they said, oh sure, here's antibiotic resistance, and here is these enzymes evolving and stuff. I was like, oh, those are great examples. Can you give me something that requires more than 1,000 amino acids? And crickets chirping, right? No, they can't do that. It's a statistical problem.
Without a degree like you have, how can we explain what we heard tonight to someone who asks us, why don't you believe in evolution? Can you give us a simple little explanation?
A one-liner?
Yeah.
The best one-liner is, can you show me an example of evolution in action beyond 1,000 amino acids? And if you don't understand what they bring back to you, bring it to me. But they won't bring anything back to you. Beyond that, to try to say that this is simple, it's not. That's why it took me several years to to come to the place that I have. To say that there's an easy one-liner, an easy explanation that will solve it for everybody, it's just not going to happen. It's a very complicated topic. That's why the vast majority of scientists are not stupid. They came to their position in Darwinism, belief in Darwinism, for very rational, logical reasons. It looks really good on the surface. When you just look at it, you say, yeah, everything changes. There's all kinds of different animals, and the mutations happens. Natural selection is real. Antibiotic resistance happens. Man, this looks good. Look at all those fossils. The fossils in the fossil record, they start out small and they grow big. You know, as you go up, the evolutionary sequence looks really good. It's very convincing. And to try to counter that with a one-liner just ain't going to happen. Right? You have to be very detailed with it. And even then, trying to convince somebody who's already grown up with it, they've been educated in this perspective from birth. Our whole school system entrenches our students in this. And to try to change somebody's entire paradigm, their whole meaning in life, and everything is based on it, it's next to impossible. It's very, very hard for somebody who's grown up in this mindset. Only somebody who's really serious about looking into the details is going to change their mind. In my experience. Yeah.
Since you said our genes are getting so corrupted, yet we're living.
Right. Yeah, that's a very common observation. Hey, how can our genome be getting worse, but we're living longer and doing better? Right. Well, because there's a lot of redundancy built into the genome. You know, you have a whole bunch of genes that does basically the same job. You mutate one of them, does that make you sick? No, you still do fine. You mutate the second one. Let's say you have 5 of them that cover each other, that do basically the same job. You mutate 4 of them, you still got 1 left. Are you going to get sick? No. You still got coverage because it's built-in redundancy. But finally you mutate the 5th one, now you get sick. Right? So in the meantime, you can do fine, you can be healthy, you can live longer, you can have lots of kids, and you can do fine. But eventually you're going to get to a point of what I call genetic meltdown. And genetic meltdown is when you finally get sick. Until that point, you may not notice any physical effect at all, but your genome is still getting worse. You're still losing redundancy, and a loss of redundancy and loss of ability to adapt to new environments. All of these things are built in, and when you start losing these things, you're getting closer and closer to the edge of finally hitting genetic meltdown. And at that point, then you're going to go into full meltdown and you won't be able to survive. But until that point, you can do just fine. What's interesting, though, about the human condition overall is that genetic diseases are becoming more and more prevalent throughout our gene pool. Things that didn't exist a few thousand years ago are becoming more and more prevalent in today's society. And so more and more common. Let me just say that not everybody has the same genetic diseases. But the odds that you're going to have some kind of genetic problem are significant, that your children will have some kind of genetic problem. It's just a miracle to me these days that any child is born healthy. Because there's so many, the odds against the child being born healthy are just more and more enormous. It's just a miracle that I think that they're born healthy these days. So I don't know if that completely answers your question. It's a fairly detailed question and fairly detailed to answer. But it's well known in modern society, even by evolutionists, that the genome is deteriorating. There's even papers published in mainstream literature, Science and Nature, and the titles of the paper are The Degeneration of Man. I mean, this is mainstream knowledge. And so the fact that we are degenerating is well understood, even by mainstream scientists. It's not something I'm making up, or that John Sanford is making up. The only controversy is the degree of decay, and if natural selection is able to compensate for it. And there's a big argument over how many detrimental mutations there are per generation. But it's becoming really convincing that there are way more than the human reproductive capacity can compensate for. And the reason why bacteria don't get extinct is because bacteria can produce a whole lot of offspring, hundreds and thousands of offspring, quick-like, where humans produce too slowly, and we can't suffer a 99.99% death rate without heading for extinction. So we can't deal with the detrimental mutations by natural selection. Yes?
It seems to me that there's a cultural equivalent as well. And sociologically and culturally, we seem to be deteriorating And I've always felt, to some degree, that there's a built-in self-destruct in man, somehow.
Yeah, but that's more to do with morality, right? You can get smarter, but be more evil, right? Does becoming smarter make you less evil by itself?
No.
No, it just makes you better at being evil, right? And so, yeah, the whole ethics of humanity, it's kind of all tied together, because once we rebel from God, we started degenerating physically and morally. Right? The only way to get back to a whole man, the whole humanity, is for God to recreate both sides of us. He's got to recreate us physically, and He's got to be born again, right? What does that mean? He's got to recreate us morally and ethically as well.
This degenerative process you're talking about, can it be speeded up or slowed down depending upon diet and lifestyle?
No, not really. As far as the gene pool is concerned, it's not. I mean, obviously, if you go and sit beside Chernobyl for a while, that would speed it up for you and your offspring. But these mutations are gamete mutations, right? And your lifestyle may slightly alter your detrimental mutation rate for your gametes, but not really all that significantly overall. So it doesn't really play a significant role. Most of these mutations, the vast majority of them on the germ line, are the result just of random chance mutations. Because every time you copy the DNA in a cell, there's an error rate. The copy proteins are not perfect. They make errors every once in a while. And it's that error rate that is the primary cause of these mutations in the germ line. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it.